Happy Monday, Bio 47. Today we'll be working through just the first part of Lab 16. So we're going to be looking at just the digestive portions, those superior portions of the digestive system. We're going to save the respiratory part for after exam 4. So I'm going to be going through the first part of Lab 16. That's about pages 1 through 4. I'll be looking at the buccal or the oral cavity, more commonly referred to as the mouth, and the pharynx, more commonly referred to as the throat, and some of the structures that are associated with those. So I'll disappear so I can show you my PowerPoint. So we'll first be looking at some of these structures that are associated with the buccal cavity or the oral cavity, commonly referred to as the mouth. It's the first site of ingestion and of mechanical and chemical digestion. So there are accessory structures of the teeth and the tongue that start those mechanical digestion processes, breaking food down into smaller pieces. And the salivary glands secrete saliva that contains salivary amylase, and that starts that chemical breakdown of carbohydrates. So there are 3 paired sets of salivary glands, and they're collectively producing up to 1.5 liters of saliva a day. So you're swallowing a lot of spit throughout the day. Saliva is around 99.5% water, and the remaining 0.5% is enzymes, mucus, electrolytes, and antibacterial compounds. The primary function of human saliva is to moisten the mucous membrane, keep everything inside the mouth really moist, as well as to begin the breakdown of carbohydrates, so secreting mucus and starting chemical digestion. So there are 3 pairs of salivary glands. And the first and the biggest pair is this parotid salivary gland. The parotid is adjacent to the ear. It's the largest salivary gland. It overlies the masseter muscle, that primary muscle of chewing, and it drains saliva into the oral cavity through the parotid duct. And it's making about 25% of the total saliva. So there would be one of these on either side. You'll see some of these in the other lab videos, these salivary glands, and you'll see that they sort of have this cottage cheese texture appearance, like some of those other exocrine and endocrine glands that we've been looking at, telling you that they are this glandular structure. The next one is the submandibular gland, one of these on either side. And this is producing about 70% of the total saliva, and it's released into the buccal cavity through the submandibular duct. If you lift up your tongue and you look under that inferior surface, on either side of the frenulum, you'll see 2 little openings. Those are the submandibular ducts releasing saliva into the buccal cavity. The last one is the sublingual salivary glands. These are inferior to the tongue. They're in the floor of the mouth, and they're about the size of an almond. They're releasing saliva through these really small, short sublingual ducts along the base of the tongue, and they're primarily making mucus. So we have these 3 sets of salivary glands, the parotid salivary glands that are really big, and beside the ear, the submandibular salivary gland below the mandible, and the sublingual salivary gland under the tongue in the floor of the mouth. Part of the mechanical digestion that takes place within the oral cavity is due to the action of the teeth. In adults, there are 32 teeth, and they're typically paired structures, and they're called different names according to how many cusps are in a cusp. Is a raised point on the crown of the tooth. So the front teeth, there's 1, 2 incisors that don't have any cusps, they just have a cutting surface. The canine or cuspid tooth has one point, and there's one on either side. So 2 incisors, 1 canine or cuspid. Then there's 2 pairs of premolars or bicuspids. They have 2 cusps, and then up to 3 sets of molars or tricuspids. And these tricuspids really have up to 4 or 5 cusps. So that's what's shown down here too. There's 1, 2 incisors, then 1 canine or cuspid tooth, then 2 premolars or bicuspid teeth, and then 1, 2, 3 molars or tricuspid teeth. That last one is the wisdom tooth that's absent in some individuals and surgically removed in many other individuals. Also present inside of the buccal cavity is the tongue. And the tongue is a specialized skeletal muscle structure. It manipulates ingested food, and sensory structures on its surface sense a complex array of tastes. It's covered with a thick, stratified squamous epithelium, a mucous membrane, and it has numerous projections that stick off of it called papillae. And the papillae increase friction along the tongue surface, and they harbor the sensory structures for taste. If you look at your tongue in the mirror and you see a lot of bumps on it, those are the papillae. Those are not the taste buds. Taste buds are microscopic structures, remember, that are within the sides of the papillae. So those bumps, the papillae, they're epithelial projections across the tongue surface, and they allow for greater manipulation and greater friction. They have taste buds located along their lateral margins. In humans, we'll be looking at primarily 3 different types of papillae. The first one is filiform or thread-like papillae. These are numerous, small, thin prominences across 2/3 of the tongue surface. They're functioning only in mechanical digestion, so manipulation of food. They don't have any taste buds on their surface. So these are the most common. Fungiform, or sort of mushroom-shaped papillae, are scattered about the dorsum of the tongue. They have taste buds along their lateral edge. And circumvallate are these 8 to 12 large dome-shaped cones located at the posterior of the tongue in a V-shaped row. So this V-shaped row right here. They also have taste buds along their lateral edges. And then there's some that form these folds along the lateral sides of the tongue. And they're called foliate papillae. And they also house taste buds. And they're not described in your lab manual. So these fungiform, circumvallate, and foliate papillae all house taste buds along their lateral surfaces, and that's what's shown here. The taste bud. Remember that taste buds are chemoreceptors. They contain specialized gustatory cells that have taste hairs that detect tastants or molecules that are dissolved in saliva. The action of the salivary glands releasing that watery mucus helps to dissolve food in a liquid and allow it to be tasted by these taste buds, which we talked about when we talked about the special senses. More generally, inside of the buccal cavity, some structures that you're going to want to be able to identify. And I'll just go down the list in your lab manual. The first one here is the frenulum. The frenulum is that line along the inferior surface of the tongue. It's the tissue that anchors the tongue to the floor of the mouth. So it's this line of anchoring tissue. You'll see there's some other frenulums that are illustrated in this image as well. One that's anchoring the lower lip, and one that's anchoring the upper lip. but the one described in your lab manual is this lingual frenulum, the one that's anchoring the tongue to the floor of the mouth. Right behind the teeth, if you were to take the tip of your tongue and put it on the back of your upper incisors and then run it posteriorly, you'd be running over the hard palate. It's right here. This is a ridged, hardened anterior portion of the roof of the oral cavity. Remember that this is the palatine bones and the palatine processes of the maxillary bones. If you kept running your tongue backwards, then you get into an area that feels softer. That's the soft palate. This is the fleshy posterior portion of the roof of the mouth. And the soft palate ends with the uvula, that little piece of flesh that hangs down. The uvula is a little grape shape. It functions to manipulate speech, and it moves superiorly. It flips back to stop food from entering into the nasopharynx during swallowing. Other structures described in your lab manual is the vestibule. So this space right here between the teeth and the lips and the cheeks, this space, that's the vestibule. Back at the soft palate are the palatoglossal arches and the palatopharyngeal arches. These are prominent lateral muscular folds in the posterior region of the mouth. The palatoglossal extend from the palate to the base of the tongue. So palato, the palate, and then glosso down to the tongue. And the palatopharyngeal extend from the palate to the pharynx. And these can be seen if you stretch your tongue in the mirror and stretch it anteriorly and inferiorly. You can see these arches moving around. Also, here at the posterior aspect of the buccal cavity, there are the paired palatine tonsils. These palatine tonsils are located between these two sets of arches, so between the palatoglossal and the palatopharyngeal arches. They're lymphoid structures, so they're large aggregations of white blood cells involved in immunity. The digestive tract, as you know, has an extensive amount of lymphoid tissue, and it's geared to recognizing invaders that might have been ingested. There are a total of 5 tonsils. We're only seeing the 2 paired palatine tonsils here. One thing that's not illustrated on this picture, but is described in your lab manual, is the fauces. So the fauces is from the Latin for the throat, and it's the opening into the pharynx. So all of this right here would be the fauces. It's bound by the soft palate up here, and by the tongue, and by the pharyngeal arches. So that's the fauces. So we'll keep looking and going down into the pharynx. We've already talked about the pharynx in the context of the digestive system and of the respiratory system. So you know that the pharynx is that common space through which both ingested material and inhaled air can pass. So it's a common passageway for the respiratory tract and the gastrointestinal tract. And it's divided up into 3 regions according to the location. The first is the nasopharynx, that's superior to the soft palate. It's functioning to pass air from the nasal cavity to the inferior respiratory passages. The second portion is the oropharynx, that's the back of the throat between the soft palate and the epiglottis. So there's the epiglottis there, that spoon-shaped cartilage that can cover the larynx while swallowing. So this right here, number 2, the oropharynx. It functions to pass both food and air to inferior regions. The last portion, number 3, is the laryngopharynx. It's between the epiglottis at the level of the hyoid bone. Remember that bone that doesn't articulate with any other bone. It serves as an attachment site for some of these muscles that are moving the pharynx and larynx. So laryngopharynx from the level of the epiglottis and the hyoid bone and down to the opening of the esophagus. And it's functioning to pass ingested materials as well as air to inferior regions. So also shown here is the epiglottis. It's a flap of elastic cartilage that can cover the opening into the larynx. The opening into the larynx is called the glottis. So it prevents movement of swallowed materials into the larynx. So this would be the larynx down here with the vestibular folds and the vocal folds. Up here would be the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage. Posterior to the trachea is the esophagus. That's about a 10-inch long collapsed muscular tube that extends from the pharynx down into the stomach. And it passes posterior to the trachea, going through the thoracic cavity. And then it passes through the esophageal hiatus of the diaphragm to connect to the stomach. And at rest, you're typically breathing, not swallowing. So your pharynx would look like this, with the pathway to the trachea open, with the pathway through the nasopharynx open. But over here on the right is shown what happens during the swallowing reflex, during that process of swallowing. So up there at the top is the first step. This is showing somebody's been chewing on a bolus of food. They get ready to swallow. What happens? The tongue moves up to the roof of the mouth and forces the food back to the posterior aspect of the oral cavity. And then just as soon as that bolus hits the palatoglossal arches of the fauces, this is where it kicks into a reflex, an involuntary action. So once this swallowing reflex starts, it's hard to stop it. So what is that swallowing reflex? In this first part, you can see that the soft palate and the uvula have flipped up to prevent food from entering into the nasopharynx. So they've changed position. The uvula and the soft palate are now protecting the nasopharynx. And in this next part, we have the food traveling down through the oropharynx and starting to go into the laryngopharynx. And in this part, you can see that the epiglottis is now closing over the larynx. The vocal folds and the vestibular folds would be closing over the trachea. And the superior esophageal sphincter is open, allowing for food to pass into the esophagus. And then the bolus is pushed by peristalsis down the esophagus, and it's being carried down into the stomach. And now we can have the pharynx and the larynx back to their relaxed state. So during swallowing, it's a temporary period of not breathing. The whole respiratory tract is cut off by that soft palate and uvula moving up, and the epiglottis covering over the larynx. So it's preventing the flow of air through the respiratory system. You may want to be able to identify some of these structures on a cadaver view as well. So this is a sagittal section of a cadaver. And this would be the buccal cavity right here, the opening into the buccal cavity. This whole thing is the muscular tongue. And you'd expect to find sublingual and submandibular salivary glands. We can't see the parotid glands because they would be on the side. This structure right here would be a section through the mandible, through the bone of the mandible. You have the hard palate up here, made up of those palatine bones and the palatine process of the maxillary bone. And then back here would be the soft palate leading into the uvula. So everything above the level of the uvula is the nasopharynx. And then from the uvula down to the epiglottis and hyoid bone, this area is the oropharynx. And then down from the epiglottis to the entrance into the esophagus, that'll be the laryngopharynx. So you can see that the esophagus is collapsed while at rest, and the trachea is maintained open. So there's the trachea more anterior, and the esophagus more posterior. So not too long of a lab for today. Definitely look at pages 1, 2, 3, and 4 of lab 16. We're going to save the rest of it for after exam 4. Check out that lab 16 visible body activity as well. And let me know if you have any questions.